The candles along the Vale dining table had burned low by the time Dorothy noticed the goblet was wrong. She had been watching Gerald all evening, the way one watches a man who has already decided what he intends and is only waiting for the proper moment to enact it. She had not known precisely what she was watching for. She had known only that her father's strongbox key lay against her sternum on its ribbon, pressing a small cold circle into her skin, and that Gerald Vane had been watching the wine service with an attention that had nothing to do with thirst. The goblet at her right hand was not the one that had been set before her when she took her seat. She understood this with the particular, steady clarity that her father had called her best quality, and Gerald had spent years teaching her to distrust. The goblet she had been given was plain pewter, a Vale family piece. The goblet now at her right hand was the same style, the same size, but the base carried a small notch in the rim that the other had not. She sat with her hands in her lap and did not raise it to drink, and kept her face as composed as the room required. Gerald was laughing at something Mr. Fotherby had said. The solicitor, a careful man with kind eyes behind his spectacles, was nodding into his own wine. At the far end of the table, Lord Crestwick sat with the characteristic stillness that Dorothy had come to read, over the course of 4 weeks of unwanted proximity, as the discipline of a man who does not permit his body to conduct itself without his permission. He had not laughed. He was watching the room. He was watching her. Dorothy set the goblet to the side with a deliberate motion, sliding it 2 inches away from her hand and toward the center of the table, and reached instead for the water glass. Gerald's laughter did not stop. His eyes moved to the goblet, and then to her, and for one brief, terrible instant, his smile thinned. He reached for the goblet. Dorothy said pleasantly, without raising her voice, "I believe that one belongs to Mr. Fotherby, Gerald. He was moved when you changed the seating arrangement. His glass remained where it was." It was not true. Mr. Fotherby had arrived before the seating cards were altered and had taken the chair Gerald directed him toward, without question. Gerald did not know precisely what Fotherby had done, and Fotherby himself looked confused. And Gerald's hand withdrew from the goblet with the measured smoothness of a man who has changed a gesture in the middle of its arc. He said with warmth, "How attentive you are, Dorothy. Always watching over us." "I do my best," she said. At the far end of the table, the Earl of Crestwick said nothing. His dark gray eyes had moved from Gerald's hand to Dorothy's water glass, and stayed there, and did not move for a long time. The candles burned lower. Dorothy's hands did not tremble. She had spent too many years teaching them not to. The letter had come in the 3rd week of November, 6 months after her father's death, addressed not to Dorothy, but to the household, as though no particular inhabitant were expected to make decisions about its contents. It was from Fotherby's office, brief and precise, and it concerned the eastern meadow boundary of Valewood, the 12-acre parcel that her father had conveyed to her by deed in the last weeks of his life, and which Gerald contended he had had no legal authority to convey. Dorothy had found the original deed herself, in the strongbox, on the morning after the funeral. She had read it twice, sitting alone in her father's study with the smell of old paper and pipe tobacco around her. And then she had folded it exactly along its original creases and placed it back in the box, and pressed the brass key into her palm until it left a mark. She had not told Gerald she had found it. She had not told anyone. Her father's last words to her, delivered in the grip of the illness that had hollowed him to a frame, had been clear on the matter. "Trust what you read with your own eyes, Dottie. Not what someone tells you it says." Gerald Vane had arrived at Valewood 3 days after the funeral. He had brought his mother, Lady Sophronia, and 2 footmen, and a letter from a London solicitor who was not Fotherby. and a manner of settled ownership that made every servant in the house walk a little more quietly. He had told Dorothy that the estate would naturally fall to him now, that the Eastern Meadow deed was informal and contestable, and that the wisest course for a woman in her position would be to accept the comfortable arrangement he and Sophronia had prepared. He had patted her hand when he said it, the way one pats the hand of a person one does not expect to understand the conversation. She had said, "I will consider the matter," and gone to her room and taken the deed from the strong-box and stitched the key to the ribbon she wore around her neck under her gown, where it sat now, a warm and quiet assurance against the cool of the November air. The difficulty was that Fatherby required her signature and the original deed to complete the filing, and Gerald had arranged, through Sophronia's management of the household calendar, that Dorothy was never to be found at an address where Fatherby could reach her alone. The county assembly, the morning calls, the dinners at neighboring estates, all produced Gerald or Sophronia at her elbow, positioned between her and the solicitor, with the practiced ease of people who have navigated social arrangements for decades and know precisely how to obstruct without appearing to. By the time Christmas arrived, Dorothy had not managed a single private conversation with Fatherby in 8 weeks. It was Fatherby himself who found a way, through the medium of Lord Crestwick. The Earl of Crestwick's estate at Crestwick Hall bordered the eastern meadow in question. He had a legitimate interest in the boundary dispute, being the adjacent landowner, and Fatherby, who was nothing if not methodical, sent a formal inquiry to the Hall requesting the Earl's maps and any boundary records in the Crestwick archive. The Earl's response, returned within a week, included a note addressed to Miss Vale through Fatherby, inviting her to inspect the boundary markers directly, as it would clarify the line in question and assist the legal process. Dorothy had read the note 3 times. She did not know whether Crestwick had grasped the arrangement Gerald had imposed, or whether the invitation was purely procedural. She suspected the latter. Everything she had heard of the Earl of Crestwick suggested a man of precision and limited sentiment, and nothing in the note's 2 careful sentences suggested anything but the efficient management of a property matter. She told Gerald she was making a call on behalf of Fatherby. Gerald had looked at her with the particular patience of a man who believes patience is never truly necessary, and smiled and told her she was very good to concern herself with matters beyond her capacity to resolve. She was in the Crestwick Hall carriage by 9 o'clock the following morning. The house was not what she had expected. She had assembled it in her imagination as a piece of formal architecture, ordered and cold as the man reported to inhabit it, all marble and closed doors. What she found instead was a house that had the quality of a place that had once been full of sound and was now learning to manage its own quiet. The fires were lit and attended. The floors were swept. A child's boot was at the bottom of the stairs, unmistakably a child's boot. Mud still on the toe, as though the owner had left it there on the way to something more interesting and not been sufficiently concerned about the consequence to retrieve it. The man who met her in the front hall was not the butler. Lord Crestwick was 34 years old and carried his height as if he had made a practical decision about it rather than a vanity, the broad shoulders of his navy tailcoat holding their line without contrivance. The scar at his left brow was fine and faded, the mark of something old. His dark gray eyes moved to her with the particular quality of attention that does not waste itself on surfaces. He said, "Miss Vale," and nothing else for a moment, as though the greeting had covered everything necessary, and the next step was hers. She said, "My lord, I am grateful for your assistance in this matter." "The boundary concerns us both," he said. "Come in out of the cold." It was not warmth, precisely. It was something more like efficiency applied in the direction of comfort, which was, Dorothy was beginning to understand, his characteristic mode. The maps were in the library, and it was in the library, while she was cross-checking the Crestwick boundary survey against the language of her father's deed, that she first heard Peter. He came through the side door with the purposeful irreverence of a boy of 9 who has recently discovered that a library is not primarily a place for maps, but also contains a significant number of excellent hiding places and at least 3 volumes with illustrations of sea creatures of an engrossing character. He stopped when he saw Dorothy. He looked at her with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to pretend he is not doing so. He said, "Who are you?" Dorothy said, "I am Miss Vale. I have come to look at maps." He considered this. "Maps of where?" "Of the boundary between this estate and mine." He tilted his head. "Are you in a dispute?" "I am," she said. "With Lord Crestwick?" "With my cousin." He seemed to find this satisfactory. He settled into the chair across from hers, as though this had been the arrangement all along, and after a moment said, "My name is Peter. Will you stay for luncheon?" Dorothy was looking at the map. She said, without looking up, "That is Lord Crestwick's decision, not mine." "He will say yes if I ask him," Peter said, with the serenity of someone stating an observable fact. She looked at him then. He was watching her with a directness she recognized, the directness of a person who has had to learn people quickly and has become good at it. She said, "Then you may ask him if you like." He did. And Crestwick, when he appeared in the doorway to collect the boy for the morning's lesson, looked at Dorothy across the table and at the map spread between her hands and at the precision with which she had annotated the boundary markers in the estate record she had brought with her, and said with the minimal expenditure of expression that was beginning to feel less like coldness and more like restraint, "You are welcome to stay." She stayed. She did not know what she had expected from the luncheon. She found, instead, a table at which Peter asked questions with the same relentless appetite that she had spent years teaching herself to suppress in company, and at which Lord Crestwick answered most of them directly, and deferred the rest with the quiet patience of a man who finds patience less of an effort with children than with adults. She said very little. She watched. When the footman refilled her glass, Lord Crestwick watched the footman. When Peter reached too far across the table, Lord Crestwick said, "Peter," in a tone that contained no heat but absolute certainty, and Peter retrieved his arm. When Dorothy reached for the map she had set to the side and found it covered by the water jug, Lord Crestwick lifted the jug without being asked and set it elsewhere, and returned to the conversation with Peter as though the gesture had not occurred. She noticed that she was looking at his hands. She stopped looking at his hands. She said, on her way out, standing in the hall with her pelisse on and her papers in her satchel, "I believe the survey of 1809 is the controlling document. The language in my father's deed maps precisely to the Crestwick boundary as it was measured in that year." He said, "I had the same reading." She said, "It will be useful to say so to Mr. Fotherby." "I intend to," he said. He held the door for her. The cold came in, and she stepped through it. And when she glanced back from the carriage step, she saw him still standing in the hall, not watching her depart, but looking at the survey in his own hand, a slight line between his brows, as though something in the numbers was still resolving itself. She thought, on the road home, that she had not once, in 3 hours in that house, felt unsuitable. It was a strange thing to notice. She made herself not notice it again. The assembly at the Nettleford Rooms was the first occasion on which Gerald attempted the label in public. It was 3 weeks later, and Fotherby had been in attendance, and Gerald had positioned himself and Sophronia between Dorothy and the solicitor from the moment they entered with a facility that Dorothy could only admire for its precision. It was Sophronia who employed the phrase, During a break in the dancing, when the room had rearranged itself into conversational clusters, and Fatherby had moved toward Dorothy from the far side of the room, Sophronia intercepted him with a rustling of silk and a warmth calculated to the degree, and said, loudly enough that the nearest cluster heard, "Dear Mr. Fatherby, you must forgive Dorothy her confusion about the meadow business. We are all so fond of her, but she is quite unsuitable for serious affairs. Her father, God rest him, was always managing her enthusiasms, and now it falls to us." Fatherby had looked at Sophronia with his careful, spectacled attention. He had looked at Dorothy. Dorothy had held herself still, her fan open in her hand, and smiled the social smile that occupies the face while the mind is occupied elsewhere. She had been thinking about the small brass key against her sternum. She had been thinking that the survey of 1809 supported her deed, and that Lord Crestwick had said so. She was thinking, when she found herself standing in the library at Crestwick Hall 2 days later for the second time in a month, that she was not going to leave without telling Fatherby what she held in her possession. The second visit had been arranged under the same procedural pretext as the first, a discrepancy in the western fence line that Fatherby's note to Crestwick had cited as requiring verification. Dorothy had come with the note and her maps and the composure she had spent the carriage ride constructing. She had not expected to be alone in the library, but Peter had a cold and was confined to his rooms, and the footman who had shown her in had retreated without confirming where Lord Crestwick was, and so she had stood at the library table for 10 minutes, looking at the portrait. It was on the far wall, between the 2 windows, and it had been turned to face the wall. This was not an accident of furniture arrangement. The frame was proper mahogany, and the painting within it was, she could tell from the back's canvas breadth, a formal portrait of some size. Someone had turned it deliberately and positioned it facing the plaster with the same decisiveness applied to everything in this house. She was still looking at it when Lord Crestwick came in. He stopped when he saw her gaze, and his face did not change in any observable way, but something in the quality of the room shifted, the way a room shifts when a window is closed against the wind. She said, "Forgive me. I was waiting." He said, "You have been here some time." "Yes." He did not cross to the portrait. He crossed to the table and set his hands on the map she had unrolled, and studied it. And she watched the slight tension in his jaw that she had learned was his equivalent of what other men expressed with considerably more apparatus. She said, because she was not a person who pretended she had not seen what she had seen, "You need not explain it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Her name was Eleanor. She died 3 years ago in February." He did not say anything further. She did not ask. The name sat in the room between them with the weight of a thing that has been carried a long time and has made marks in the carrying. She understood, in that moment, why he issued short commands that functioned as care and kept a child's boot at the bottom of the stairs and arranged his face into strict neutrality when a boy of 9 reached too far across the table. Not because he felt nothing, because what he felt was not something he had yet learned to carry in public, and he was still engaged in the learning. She said, "The survey is very clear. The eastern meadow belongs to my deed." "Yes," he said. "My cousin will contest it regardless." "Yes," he said again. She looked at the map. She said, "I have the original deed in a strongbox. I have been unable to arrange a private conversation with Mr. Fatherby to complete the filing." She paused. "My cousin has been very attentive to my social calendar." He raised his eyes from the map. They were very dark gray in the library light, like the surface of a river in autumn. He said, "I see." She believed from the way he said it that he did see. Entirely. She said, I thought you should know the nature of the obstacle, in the event that the boundary matter reaches a formal hearing. He said, I will speak to Fatherby. And then, after a moment, you will have your conversation with him, Miss Vale. She said, Thank you, my lord. She did not say that no one else had thought to offer such a thing. She did not say that she had been managing alone for 6 months and was very tired of it. She folded the map and placed it in her satchel and took her leave with as much composure as she had arrived with, and if her hands felt very slightly unsteady as she settled them in her lap in the carriage, there was no one to see it. If you have found yourself holding your breath through any part of this story, you are exactly the listener it was written for. Stay close. Mrs. Bramble found Dorothy in the morning room on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of January and sat down without being asked, the way she had been sitting down in this house for 30 years without needing to be asked, and folded her hands in her lap and said, Mr. Vane has been in the cellar. Dorothy set down the ledger she had been annotating. When? Yesterday evening, after you retired. He was there for perhaps 20 minutes. Mrs. Bramble's hands remained folded. He carried nothing in. He carried a small cloth bag when he came out. Dorothy looked at her hands. The key was warm through the fabric of her gown. She said, Has anything been disturbed in the cellar? Only in the wine alcove, Mrs. Bramble said. But I cannot say what precisely was disturbed, as I do not know what was there before. He was alone. Dorothy said, Gerald has arranged a dinner for Friday. Mr. Fatherby is invited. Lord Crestwick is invited. She paused. I believe we understand one another. Mrs. Bramble looked at her with the expression of a woman who has known a family for 30 years and is not surprised by what it produces, in either direction. She said, I will be in the dining room Friday evening. You will have no particular reason to explain your presence. I never need a particular reason, Mrs. Bramble said. It is my house. She said it with a simplicity that Dorothy recognized as the most certain thing she had heard in months. The dinner on Friday was Gerald's production, from the seating cards, to the menu, to the flowers, and Sophronia had managed the table arrangements with the air of a woman installing herself in a position she intended to hold. Arabella Fenwick was present, placed at Crestwick's left hand, pink-gowned and composed, her conversation a steady and pleasant demonstration of how suitable she was. Gerald had placed Dorothy 3 chairs from Fatherby and placed himself between them. Crestwick arrived last. He took his seat without ceremony, spoke briefly to Arabella, and found Dorothy's eyes across the table with the directness that she had come to understand was not rudeness, but the practiced precision of a man who does not require an excuse to look at what he is looking at. She had given him the deed that morning, not through Fatherby, directly. She had ridden to Crestwick Hall at 7 o'clock in the morning, before Gerald was awake, with the deed in a sealed envelope from her satchel and the brass key in her palm, and had handed both to the Earl in the hall of his house, while Peter watched from the stairs with great interest. Lord Crestwick had looked at the envelope. He had looked at her. He had said, I will give it to Fatherby before the evening. She had said, I trust you, and had meant it, and had been startled by what it felt like to mean it. The dinner proceeded. Gerald was charming and precise, and did not once look at the wine service except when he believed no one was watching him. And Dorothy watched him without appearing to watch him, and when the footman placed the goblets and Gerald adjusted his own, she saw his hand move for half a second toward the place where her goblet stood. Only half a second. Then his attention returned to Fatherby. The toasts were Gerald's idea, proposed at the end of the first remove, when the wine had been poured and the candles had descended into their slow burn. He rose and lifted his glass and spoke about family and the proper management of inherited responsibilities, words that meant nothing and everything at once, arranged in the cadence of a man who had rehearsed them. Sophronia raised her glass. Fatherby raised his with the polite precision of a man attending a social obligation. Arabella raised hers. Dorothy sat still. She heard the slight catch in Gerald's breath as he reached for what he believed was her goblet. He had not expected her stillness. He had expected, she thought, that she would have drunk from it. That it would already be done, and that by the time anyone thought to examine the evening's sequence of events, there would be nothing to examine. Her hands were in her lap. The goblet he had reached for was still where she had set it, 2 inches from its original position, and she had not touched it. And she was looking at him across the length of the table with a composure so complete that it felt, she knew, like something other than a social expression. Gerald said, his voice carrying the warmth of a man who has already decided the world is arranged as he requires. "Come, Dorothy. You have not drunk to the family's health." She said, "I find I am not thirsty." He smiled. "I see you have not been attending to the serious business of enjoying the evening. As your cousin, I must counsel you not to neglect such matters. A woman unsuitable for serious affairs ought at least to manage the pleasures." He turned to Lord Crestwick across the table, deploying the warmth of a man who has made it this far and intends to make it further. "I am sure Crestwick agrees. Our cousin is charming, but out of her depth in these arrangements." Lord Crestwick looked at Gerald. The look was the kind of look that takes no particular expression to produce and requires none. It was simply the full attention of a man who sees clearly and does not pretend he does not. He said nothing. Gerald's smile held. He reached for Dorothy's goblet again. Dorothy said, in a voice that did not waver, "Gerald, I know what you put in it." The room went very still. Gerald's hand did not withdraw. His face remained arranged in the warmth he had prepared. But beneath the warmth, something had changed. The way the surface of a river changes when the current shifts direction, without the water itself appearing to move. He said, with the particular smoothness of a man who has prepared an alternative position, "Dorothy, what a very strange thing to say." "It is," she agreed. "And it is true." Sophronia said, "This is quite enough," in the voice of a woman who has constructed her authority over decades and believes it to be self-evident. "On the contrary," Dorothy said, "I believe we are only beginning." She looked at Fatherby. "The goblet at my place was exchanged before the table was called. I observed it. Mrs. Bramble, who has managed this house for 30 years and was present in this room from 7 o'clock this evening, observed Gerald in the cellar on Wednesday. She observed what he carried out. From the side door, where she had stood for the last hour in the position of a woman who has nothing in particular to do and every reason to be there, Mrs. Bramble said, "I did." Gerald's hand withdrew from the goblet. He said, "This is an absurd accusation. I have every interest in Dorothy's continued good health." "You have an interest in the estate," Dorothy said, "which is not the same thing. Mr. Fatherby," she looked at the solicitor, "when Lord Crestwick delivered an envelope to you this morning, what did it contain?" Fatherby removed his spectacles and cleaned them with the careful deliberation of a man who is buying himself a moment to understand the full dimensions of what he has been asked. He replaced them. He said, "The original deed of conveyance for the eastern meadow parcel of Valewood, signed by your late father and properly witnessed, and a letter from Lord Crestwick confirming his agreement with the boundary survey of 1809. And have you completed the filing?" "I filed it this afternoon," Fatherby said. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which the furniture arrangement of the last 6 months has suddenly been revealed to be load-bearing. and has been removed. Gerald said, "The deed is contestable." Lord Crestwick rose from his chair. He did not do it quickly. He rose with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided where he is going and sees no reason to hurry. And he crossed to Fatherby's end of the table and picked up the goblet that Dorothy had set aside, and he set it precisely in the center of the table, where the candlelight fell on it. And he said to Fatherby, "I would suggest this be retained." Fatherby said, "I would agree." Lord Crestwick turned to Gerald. He said, "Miss Vale's signature on that deed is the only one that matters here." The words landed the way a single measured note lands when the room has been waiting for it, without force, without heat, with the absolute authority of a thing that cannot be unmade. Gerald's face held its arrangement for 2 further seconds. Then the warmth evacuated it, the way warmth evacuates a room when a fire is extinguished, not in pieces but all at once, and what remained was simply a man who had arranged for a specific outcome and had found himself in a room where that outcome was not possible. Sophronia said, "Gerald." Her voice had lost its cultivation. It sounded, for the first time Dorothy could recall, like the voice of a woman who is frightened. Gerald said, "You cannot prove anything, Mrs." Bramble said from the side door, with the serenity of a woman who has been in service for 30 years and has very little patience for men who underestimate housekeepers. "The cloth bag is in the cellar passage where you left it when you heard me coming. I locked the passage this morning. Mr. Fatherby may collect it at his convenience." There was a sound from the head of the table, very small, that Dorothy identified after a moment as Arabella setting down her wine-glass with extreme care. Fatherby said, "I think we must send for the magistrate." Gerald sat. He did not have the bearing any longer of a man who has arranged the furniture. He had the bearing of a man in a room where someone else has arranged it. Sophronia said, "Gerald, you will say nothing further," and her voice had recovered some of its structure. But the structure was smaller now, and everyone in the room could hear what was underneath it. The magistrate, a Mr. Calvert, who lived half a mile from the Vale gates, and who arrived with the composure of a man who had known something was not right in this household since November, managed the rest of the evening with a quiet efficiency that Dorothy was grateful for. Gerald went with him. He did not speak as he left, except once to look at Dorothy from the doorway and say, with all the warmth finally gone from his voice, "You will regret this." She said nothing. She had nothing to say to that. The regret had been his to accumulate. Sophronia remained for another quarter of an hour, sitting at the dining table with the rigid posture of a woman who is not yet ready to acknowledge what has happened, but is no longer in a position to deny it. Arabella Fenwick collected her wrap and her quiet, and left with the grace of a woman who has understood that she is in the wrong story and is removing herself from it without drama. Mrs. Bramble cleared the offending goblet with the care of a woman who has been careful her entire life and sees no reason to stop now. The room emptied by degrees, and when it was empty, Fatherby said to Dorothy, "You will hear from me by Monday about the formal confirmation of the filing." She said, "Thank you, Mr. Fatherby." He said, with the warmth of a man who has looked at her twice this evening and found what he was looking at, "Your father knew what he was doing. He meant the deed." She believed he meant more than the deed. When Fatherby left, the house was quiet in the specific way that a house is quiet when the thing that has been pressing on it for 6 months has been lifted. Dorothy stood in the hall for a moment, her hands at her sides, the brass key on its ribbon still warm against her chest. She was not certain what she had expected to feel at this moment. She had been so occupied with what needed to be done that she had not made any predictions about feeling. She heard a step behind her and turned to find Lord Crestwick at the dining-room door. He said, "Are you quite well?" She said, Yes. He looked at her for a moment with the look that she had come to know, the look that does not waste itself on surfaces, that goes where it goes without apology. He said, "You rode to my house at 7 in the morning and handed me a deed, and trusted me with it." She said, "I did." He said, "I want you to know that I understood what that was." She thought of the portrait on the wall, face in, keeping its silence. She thought of Eleanor, who had died in February 3 years past, and of the specific human sorrow of a man who has been grieving long enough to mistake the grief for a permanent condition. She thought of Peter, who had asked if she would stay for luncheon on the first day they met. With the directness of a child who has learned to reach for things before the window closes. She said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He was quiet. Then he said, "I should like to call on you tomorrow, if you are receiving." It was, she recognized, not entirely a conventional request. It had, beneath its formal syntax, the quality of something more effortful than a morning call, something said from a place that did not come easily, and was said precisely because it did not come easily. She said, "I am receiving." The hall was still. The candles had burned to their lower height. Somewhere in the back of the house, Mrs. Bramble was moving with her customary efficiency, and the sound of her presence was the sound of the house returning to its proper character. Dorothy said, "Good evening, my lord." He said, "Good evening, Miss Vale." He left. The door closed. She stood alone in the hall, her hands at her sides, and the house was hers, and the deed was filed, and the thing that had been pressing on her for 6 months was gone, and she was, for the first time in longer than she could name, simply standing in her own home. The following morning was clear. The sky that particular pale English blue that belongs to the end of January when the frost is thin, and the light, though cold, is genuine. Dorothy was in the morning room by 8, which was her habit. With her ledger open on the writing table and the fire built up and the window admitting the thin winter light across the floor. She had not slept especially well, but the quality of the wakefulness had been entirely different from what she had known these past months. The previous nights, she had been awake from concern. This night she had been awake from the curious sensation of a weight that has been carried so long that its absence is itself disorienting. She untied the ribbon from around her neck. The brass key was small in her palm, no larger than the first joint of her thumb. Its surface worn smooth where her father's hand had held it, and then worn smoother where hers had. These 6 months. It was a simple thing. It had been, in its time, a necessary thing. She turned it once, feeling the familiar press of its cut edges, and then she set it on the mantel. The strongbox was open. The deed was filed. She did not need to carry it hidden any longer. She looked at the key on the mantel for a moment. Then she returned to her ledger. Lord Crestwick arrived at 10:30, which was precisely when a morning call begins, and he came in from the cold, with the directness that was characteristic of him, and sat in the chair she indicated and accepted the tea she offered. And for a moment they were simply 2 people in a room on a January morning, which seemed, Dorothy thought, quietly strange in its ordinariness after what had preceded it. He said, "Fatherby confirmed the filing is complete." She said, "Yes." He said, "Gerald will not contest it." She understood from his tone that this was not a question and not a prediction. She said, "No, he will not." She paused. Mr. Calvert was very thorough. He nodded. He set down his tea. He looked at the mantel, where the brass key lay, and then at her, with the full dark attention that she had stopped trying to interpret and had learned simply to receive. He said, Peter asks about you." She said, "Does he?" "He has been asking since the first time you came. He asks whether you are coming back, and whether you will stay for luncheon again if you do, and whether you know any other things about boundary surveys." A slight pause. "He has developed an interest in surveying," she said. "I see." And then, because she was not a person who left important things unsaid when the opportunity to say them was present, "I am glad of it." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "I have not called on anyone in 3 years." She said, "I know." He said, "I wanted you to understand that this is not a small thing for me." She said quietly, "I know that, too." Outside, on the garden path, Mrs. Bramble had taken it upon herself to show Peter around the side beds, which were dormant in January, but which, Mrs. Bramble was explaining with great authority, would be producing sweet peas by April, if properly attended to. Peter's voice carried faintly through the glass, asking what sweet peas smelled like, and Mrs. Bramble's voice carried back, patient and exact, describing it. The fire in the morning room was warm. The pale winter light moved across the floor. The brass key on the mantel caught the light and held it, small and still, and finished with its work. Lord Crestwick said, "I should like to call again, tomorrow, and the day after." Dorothy looked at him. She thought of her father, who had said to trust what you read with your own eyes. She thought of what she had read. In 4 weeks of unwanted proximity, in the stillness of a man who does not waste himself on surfaces, and who had risen from his chair the previous evening and crossed a room and said 12 words, and she thought it was, on the evidence available, a very sound document. She said, "Then you are welcome to." He did not smile. The Earl of Crestwick was not, she suspected, a man who would ever smile easily. Something in his face that had been held at a careful angle shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a door shifts when it is no longer quite closed, and she thought that in time she would learn to read him as precisely as she read a deed of conveyance, every mark of his hand deliberate and meaning exactly what it said. Peter's voice rose briefly in the garden, delighted by something Mrs. Bramble had produced from the dormant beds, and Lord Crestwick turned his head toward the sound, and his face in the pale winter light was the face of a man who has been carrying something for a long time, and has found, this morning, that he does not have to carry it alone. The sweet peas would come in April. The deed was filed. The key lay on the mantel, done with its keeping, and the morning room was warm, and the world's verdict on Dorothy Vale had turned out not to be the final one. Thank you for staying until the end. If Dorothy's particular kind of quiet courage moved you, leave a word for her in the comments.